The dust kicked up by 20 horses settled slowly over the makeshift camp as the sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks of the Chiricahua Mountains. It was October 1885, and the last free Apache bands had finally been cornered by General Crook's forces near the Mexican border. The air carried the acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the sweet scent of desert sage, creating an atmosphere thick with the weight of endings. Thomas McKenna sat motionless on his roan gelding, watching the proceedings with the same stoic expression he had worn for the past 3 years. Ever since that day when Confederate shrapnel had torn through his throat during the final weeks of the war, leaving him forever changed, forever silent. The doctors in Atlanta had saved his life but stolen his voice, and with it, much of his connection to the world around him. He had drifted west after the war, like so many broken men seeking something they couldn't name, in territories that promised nothing but hardship. Thomas had found work as a tracker and guide, his keen eye and steady hand with a rifle making up for what his damaged vocal cords could no longer provide. The silence that had once felt like a prison had gradually become his ally, allowing him to move through the wilderness like a ghost, hearing things that escaped men who filled the air with their constant chatter. Now, at 32, Thomas had been hired by the territorial government to assist in what they euphemistically called relocation efforts. The reality was far uglier than the paperwork suggested. The remaining Apache families, mostly women, children, and elderly men, were being rounded up like cattle, their freedom measured in the distance between their current position and the train cars that would carry them to reservations in Florida, far from the sacred mountains that had been their home for countless generations. The camp buzzed with activity as soldiers processed the captured Apache families. Children clung to their mothers' skirts while government officials checked names against lists, their bureaucratic efficiency a stark contrast to the human tragedy unfolding before them. Thomas observed it all with the detached gaze of a man who had seen too much suffering to be surprised by more, yet still possessed enough humanity to feel its weight. Colonel James Morrison, a career military man with premature gray hair and eyes hardened by 20 years of frontier warfare, approached Thomas's horse. Morrison had specifically requested Thomas for this operation, knowing that his reputation for tracking and his inability to gossip about sensitive military matters made him invaluable for delicate situations. "McKenna," Morrison said, wiping sweat from his brow with a blue cavalry handkerchief, "we've got a situation that requires your particular skills. There's a girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, found hiding in a cave about 2 miles north of here. She's Apache, but here's the thing, she won't speak, not a word in any language. The interpreters think she might be traumatized, or maybe she's one of those who never learned to speak properly." Thomas nodded slightly, his weathered hands resting on the saddle horn. The irony wasn't lost on him that they would send a mute man to deal with a silent child. He gestured toward the direction Morrison had indicated, raising his eyebrows in a question. "The problem is," Morrison continued, lowering his voice as a group of Apache women passed nearby, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance, "she doesn't seem to have any family left alive. No one's claimed her, and frankly, a child like that, well, she'd have a hard time on the reservation. The government's not equipped to handle special cases, if you understand my meaning." Thomas understood perfectly. Children who couldn't integrate, who couldn't work, who required extra care, often didn't survive long in the overcrowded, underfunded reservation system. It was an ugly truth that no one spoke aloud, but everyone acknowledged. Morrison pulled out a leather pouch heavy with coins. "There's a man in Tucson, Samuel Chen, runs a trading post. He's been looking for help around his establishment, someone young enough to train, old enough to be useful. He's willing to pay good money for the right child, and he doesn't ask too many questions about paperwork. If you can convince the girl to come with you, transport her safely to Tucson, there's $200 in it for you, cash money." The offer hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying campfire. Thomas stared at the pouch, understanding the full implications of what Morrison was suggesting. This wasn't an adoption, it was a sale, a human transaction dressed up in the language of opportunity and practical necessity. The girl would become an indentured servant at best, a slave at worst, her Apache heritage stripped away and replaced with whatever identity her new owner found convenient. But the alternative, watching her disappear into the reservation system where silent orphan children often simply vanished, wasn't necessarily better. At least with Chen, she would have food, shelter, and the possibility of surviving to adulthood. Thomas had learned during his years in the territories that sometimes there were no good choices, only degrees of evil, and survival often meant choosing the lesser darkness. He nodded once, accepting the job. Morrison smiled grimly and handed him a rough map sketched on brown paper. "She's in the third cave from the eastern ridge. Corporal Jenkins found her yesterday evening, but every time anyone approaches, she retreats deeper into the cave system. We can't spare the manpower for a prolonged extraction, and frankly, your condition might make her less afraid. Sometimes silence speaks to silence." Thomas tucked the map into his vest pocket and guided his horse away from the main camp, following a narrow deer trail that wound between towering saguaro cacti and clusters of prickly pear. The late afternoon sun painted the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson, creating a beauty that seemed almost obscene against the backdrop of human suffering he had just witnessed. As he rode, Thomas found himself thinking about his own childhood in Georgia before the war changed everything. He remembered being 10 years old, hiding in the root cellar while Sherman's army passed through their county, listening to his mother's whispered prayers and feeling the weight of helplessness that comes from being too young to fight and too old to be completely shielded from the world's cruelties. Perhaps that shared understanding of powerlessness would help him connect with this Apache girl where others had failed. The cave system Morrison had described sat nestled in a cluster of red sandstone formations that jutted from the desert floor like the ruins of some ancient cathedral. Thomas dismounted about 50 yards away, tying his horse to a stunted mesquite tree and approaching the caves on foot. The silence here was profound, broken only by the distant call of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead and the soft whisper of wind through the rocks. He paused at the entrance to the third cave, allowing his eyes to adjust to the shadows within. The opening was larger than he had expected, easily tall enough for a man to stand upright, but it narrowed quickly as it receded into the rock face. Thomas could see evidence of recent occupation, a small fire ring made from carefully arranged stones, a few scattered remains of what looked like roasted pine nuts, and in the sand near the back wall, the impression of a small body that had slept curled in a tight ball. "Hello," Thomas called softly, then immediately felt foolish. His damaged vocal cords produced only a harsh whisper that barely carried beyond his own ears. Instead, he picked up a small stone and tapped it gently against the cave wall in a steady rhythm. 3 short taps, pause. 3 short taps, pause. It was a pattern he had learned from a Navajo scout years earlier, a universal signal among many southwestern tribes that indicated peaceful intentions. For several minutes, nothing happened. Thomas remained perfectly still, allowing the cave's natural acoustics to carry the sound of his breathing deeper into the darkness. He understood patience in a way that most men didn't. When you couldn't fill silence with words, you learned to make silence work for you. Then, from somewhere in the shadowy depths of the cave, came an answering sound. Not tapping, but a soft scraping, as if someone was shifting position on the sandy floor. Thomas tapped his pattern again, this time adding a 4th tap at the end. The response came more quickly now, a deliberate rustling that suggested the cave's occupant was moving closer to the entrance, though still remaining hidden. Thomas slowly reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of hardtack and a small strip of jerked beef. He placed both items on a flat rock just inside the cave entrance, then retreated several steps and sat down cross-legged in the sand, his back against a boulder. The message was clear. He was offering food, and he was willing to wait. The sun continued its descent, painting the cave entrance in shifting patterns of light and shadow. Thomas watched a family of quail emerge from a nearby cluster of cholla cactus, their distinctive head plumes bobbing as they searched for seeds in the cooling desert air. Time moved differently out here, measured not in minutes and hours, but in the rhythm of natural cycles that had continued unchanged long before white men or Apache had ever set foot in this land. As darkness began to gather in the deeper recesses of the cave, Thomas heard movement again. Closer this time, more deliberate, a small hand emerged from the shadows, pale brown fingers quickly snatching the jerked beef before disappearing again. Thomas didn't move, didn't react, simply continued his patient vigil as if nothing had happened. 20 minutes later, the hand appeared again, this time taking the hardtack. Thomas could hear the soft sounds of careful chewing from within the cave, and he allowed himself a small smile. Food was a universal language, and hunger was often stronger than fear. As the last light faded from the western sky, Thomas began to hear something that made him lean forward slightly. It was barely audible, more felt than heard, a soft humming, wordless and rhythmic like a lullaby or prayer song. The melody was unlike anything in his experience, built on intervals and progressions that seemed to echo the natural harmonies of wind through stone, water over rock. The humming continued for several minutes, growing slightly louder and more confident. Thomas realized he was witnessing something rare and precious, a frightened child comforting herself the only way she knew how, using the ancient songs of her people to push back against the darkness and loneliness that threatened to overwhelm her. When the humming finally stopped, Thomas heard movement again, and this time he caught a glimpse of his quarry. She was smaller than he had expected, probably closer to 9 than 11, with long black hair that hung in tangled waves around a face that was all eyes and sharp cheekbones. Her clothes were traditional Apache, a doe-skin dress decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the starlight, and soft moccasins that allowed her to move without sound. She crouched at the very edge of the cave entrance, ready to bolt back into the depths at the first sign of threat. Thomas remained motionless, letting her study him as thoroughly as he was studying her. In her dark eyes, he saw intelligence, wariness, and something else, a kind of ancient sadness that no child should carry. She was evaluating him, trying to determine what kind of danger he represented, and Thomas found himself hoping he would pass whatever test she was conducting. Slowly, carefully, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out his last piece of food, a small apple he had been saving for his evening meal. He placed it on the same rock where he had left the other offerings, then settled back against his boulder. The girl watched every movement with the intense focus of a wild animal, her muscles coiled and ready for flight. But instead of retreating, she surprised him by speaking. Her voice was soft, musical, carrying the distinctive accent of her people, but forming words in perfectly clear English. "Why don't you talk?" The question hung in the night air between them, direct and uncompromising in the way that only children could manage. Thomas touched his throat with one hand, then shook his head slowly. He pointed to her, then cupped his ear in a listening gesture, indicating that he had heard her humming and wanted to hear more. The girl tilted her head, studying him with new interest. "The soldiers said I don't talk, but I do talk. I just don't talk to them." She paused, considering something. "Are you a soldier?" Thomas shook his head firmly. He pulled out the rough clothes he wore, denim pants, cotton shirt, leather vest, then gestured toward the military camp in the distance and shook his head again. "Not a soldier, not part of their world of uniforms and orders and casual cruelty. My grandmother said that sometimes the spirits take away a person's voice so they can hear better. She said people who can't speak learn to listen to things that talking people miss." The girl moved slightly closer, though she remained ready to flee. "Is that what happened to you?" Thomas considered the question seriously. In a way, the child's grandmother had been right. His forced silence had taught him to observe details that others missed, to read the subtle language of body movements and facial expressions, to hear the messages carried in tone and rhythm rather than just words. He nodded slowly, then pointed to his ears, and then to her, indicating that he was listening to her in ways that went beyond simple hearing. The girl seemed to find this acceptable. She moved to the cave entrance and sat down, though she kept her legs positioned for a quick escape. "My name is Ayana. It means eternal blossom in my language. My father chose it because he said I would outlive all the wars and see peace come back to our people." Her voice carried a matter-of-fact sadness. "But my father is dead now, and my mother, and my 2 brothers. The soldiers killed them 3 days ago when they tried to run toward Mexico." Thomas felt something twist in his chest, a familiar pain that came whenever he encountered another person whose world had been shattered by violence. He wanted to tell her he understood, that he too had lost everything that mattered to him, but his damaged throat could only produce that harsh whisper that sounded more like a death rattle than human speech. Instead, he did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He opened his mouth and forced air through his scarred vocal cords, creating a sound that was barely recognizable as humming. The melody was one his mother had sung to him during those long nights in the root cellar. Amazing Grace. Though stripped of words and transformed by his damaged voice into something that sounded almost like wind through broken glass. Ayana listened intently, her head tilted slightly to one side. When he finished, she nodded approvingly. "That's a sad song, but it's not hopeless. Grandmother taught me that sad songs are important because they help carry away the bad feelings so good feelings have room to grow." She was quiet for a moment, then began to hum again herself. This time the melody was different, livelier, with complex rhythms that seemed to capture the movement of horses running across open ground. Thomas found himself leaning forward, drawn into the music despite himself. There was something hypnotic about the way she used her voice, creating sounds that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to something deeper inside him. "That's a traveling song," Ayana explained when she finished. "My grandfather taught it to me. He said it helps make long journeys shorter and dangerous paths safer. Do you have somewhere you need to travel?" The question brought Thomas back to the uncomfortable reality of his situation. He did indeed have somewhere to travel, to Tucson, to deliver this child to a man who would likely work her like an animal until she broke or died. The weight of Morrison's gold coins seemed to grow heavier in his pocket, their metallic presence a constant reminder of the transaction he had agreed to complete. But looking at Ayana now, seeing the intelligence in her eyes and hearing the haunting beauty of her songs, Thomas began to question whether he could actually go through with the plan. This wasn't a broken, traumatized child who needed to be rescued from her own inability to function. This was a young person who had survived horrors that would have destroyed many adults, who possessed skills and knowledge that most white people couldn't even recognize, let alone appreciate. "The soldiers want to take me away," Ayana said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "They say I have to go on a train to a place called Florida, where there are other Apache people living in a camp. But the man who speaks our language told me that many children die on the trains, and that the camps are places where people go to disappear slowly." Thomas nodded grimly. He had heard similar stories from other scouts and trackers who had been involved in previous relocations. The government's policy of moving Indian tribes to distant reservations was often little more than a slow-motion death sentence designed to solve the Indian problem through attrition rather than outright extermination. "There's another choice," he wanted to tell her, but the words came out as nothing more than a harsh whisper that she couldn't understand. Instead, he pulled out Morrison's map and spread it on the ground between them, using a stick to trace the route from their current location to Tucson. Ayana studied the map carefully, her finger following the path he had drawn. "You want me to come with you to this place?" she asked. "Why? What's there for me?" Thomas struggled with how to explain the situation without being able to speak clearly. He pointed to himself, then to her, then traced the path again. He held up his hand, showing all 5 fingers, then closed it into a fist and opened it again 4 times. 20. Then he pretended to eat, to drink, to sleep under a roof. Food, water, shelter, safety. But even as he tried to present it in the most positive light possible, Thomas knew he was lying by omission. He wasn't offering her freedom or happiness or the chance to preserve her Apache heritage. He was offering her survival, and even that came with a price that no child should have to pay. Ayana watched his gestures carefully, her young face serious beyond her years. "You're not telling me everything," she said finally. "I can see it in your eyes. There's something bad about this place you want to take me to." Thomas felt his face flush with shame. The child was too perceptive, too intelligent to be fooled by his crude pantomime. He nodded reluctantly, then touched his heart and shook his head sadly. Yes, there was something bad about it. No, he didn't like it any more than she would. "But it's better than the train to Florida," she pressed. Thomas considered this carefully, then nodded slowly. Yes, probably better than the train to Florida. At least in Tucson she would be on familiar land, under skies that her ancestors had known. At least there would be a chance, however small, that she might someday find a way to escape and return to what remained of her people. Ayana was quiet for a long time, staring up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but determined. "My grandmother used to say that sometimes the spirits put us in impossible places to teach us things we couldn't learn any other way. She said, the important thing isn't whether the path is easy or hard, but whether we walk it with courage." She turned to look directly at Thomas, her dark eyes reflecting starlight. "If I come with you, will you promise me something?" Thomas nodded, though he wasn't sure what he was agreeing to. "Promise me that you'll remember my real name, even if other people call me something else. Promise me that you'll remember I'm Apache, even if I have to pretend to be something different. And promise me that if you ever get the chance to help me find my way back to my people, you'll take it." The weight of her request settled over Thomas like a physical burden. She was asking him to be more than just her captor and deliverer. She was asking him to be her protector, her witness, her link to an identity that the white world would try its best to erase. It was a responsibility that terrified him because he knew his own limitations, his own cowardice, his own tendency to choose survival over principle. But looking into her young face, seeing the hope and trust that she was somehow managing to maintain despite everything she had endured, Thomas found himself nodding agreement. He touched his heart, then pointed to her, then to the stars overhead, a gesture that in many Plains tribes indicated a sacred promise, one that would be witnessed by the eternal spirits. Ayana smiled for the first time since he had arrived, an expression that transformed her solemn features and revealed the child she still was beneath the burden of premature wisdom. "Then I'll come with you, Silent Man, but I have one more thing to do first." She disappeared back into the cave and emerged a few minutes later carrying a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. Inside, Thomas could see personal items, a few pieces of turquoise jewelry, what looked like a small medicine bundle, and a wooden flute decorated with intricate carvings. These were the last physical connections to her old life, the portable remnants of a culture that was being systematically destroyed. "These belong to my grandmother," Ayana explained, retying the bundle carefully. "She gave them to me before she died last winter. She said that as long as I kept them safe, a part of our people would survive, even if everything else was lost." Thomas understood the sacred nature of what she was carrying. These weren't just sentimental keepsakes. They were cultural artifacts, repositories of knowledge and spiritual power that represented thousands of years of Apache tradition. The fact that she was entrusting them to their journey together was both an honor and a tremendous responsibility. As they prepared to leave the cave that had been her refuge, Ayana paused at the entrance and began to sing again. This time, the melody was different, slower, more formal, with a quality that seemed to echo off the stone walls and linger in the night air long after the notes had ended. Thomas recognized it instinctively as a farewell song, a way of honoring a place that had provided safety and marking the transition from one phase of life to another. When she finished, Ayana looked up at him, with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone her age. "I'm ready now," she said simply. Thomas helped her onto his horse, settling her in front of him, where he could keep her secure during the ride to Tucson. As they moved away from the cave system and began the long journey south, he found himself wondering what he had gotten himself into. He had accepted what he thought was a simple transaction: transport a child from one place to another for money. But Ayana's songs, her intelligence, her quiet dignity had already begun to change something fundamental about the nature of their relationship. Behind them, the lights of the military camp grew smaller and eventually disappeared entirely, swallowed by the vast darkness of the desert night. Ahead lay Tucson and Samuel Chen's trading post, and whatever future awaited a silent Apache girl in a world that had no place for her people. But for now, in the space between one destiny and another, there was just the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves, the whisper of night wind through the creosote bushes, and the sound of Ayana's voice as she sang traveling songs to guide them safely through the darkness. As they rode, Thomas found himself thinking about the promises he had made. How could he help preserve the identity of a child whose very survival might depend on forgetting who she was? How could he protect someone when he couldn't even protect himself? And how could he find the courage to do what was right when he had spent the last 3 years simply trying to survive in a world that seemed designed to break people like them? The answers to those questions lay somewhere ahead, hidden in the uncertain future that awaited them in Tucson. But for the first time in years, Thomas felt something stirring inside him that might have been hope. Perhaps Ayana's grandmother had been right. Perhaps sometimes losing your voice was the first step toward learning to truly hear. And perhaps two damaged souls, traveling together through the darkness, might find something in each other that neither could discover alone. The night stretched endlessly before them, full of dangers and possibilities that neither could fully imagine. But they rode forward anyway, guided by starlight and the ancient songs of a people who had learned to find their way through darkness long before maps were ever drawn or roads were ever built. In the distance, a coyote howled its lonesome call to the moon, and Ayana answered with a soft melody that seemed to bridge the gap between human music and the wild symphony of the desert night. Their journey had begun, and there would be no turning back. Chapter 2. The Weight of Gold. The first light of dawn painted the Sonoran desert in shades of amber and rose as Thomas and Ayana approached the outskirts of Tucson. They had traveled through the night, stopping only twice to rest the horse and allow Ayana to drink from Thomas's water canteen. During those quiet moments, she had continued her soft singing, sometimes lullabies that seemed to calm both the horse and Thomas's frayed nerves. Other times, what she called walking songs that helped mark the rhythm of their journey. Thomas had found himself mesmerized by the child's voice. There was something otherworldly about the way she could create melodies that seemed to capture the essence of their surroundings. The whisper of wind through ocotillo branches, the distant howl of coyotes, the soft percussion of their horses' hooves on the packed earth. It was as if she possessed a musical language that could translate the voice of the land itself. As they crested a low ridge, the sprawling adobe buildings of Tucson came into view. The territorial capital was larger than Thomas had expected, with perhaps 3,000 residents scattered across a grid of dusty streets that radiated out from the old Spanish presidio at its heart. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, creating a hazy layer that hung over the settlement in the still morning air. Church bells were ringing somewhere in the distance, calling the faithful to early mass. Ayana shifted uncomfortably in the saddle in front of him. She had grown increasingly quiet as they approached civilization, her earlier songs fading into tense silence. Thomas could feel the rigid set of her small shoulders, the way she held herself as if preparing for a blow. "Is this the place?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded, then immediately regretted the gesture when he felt her tense even further. He wanted to offer some words of comfort, some reassurance that everything would be all right. but his damaged throat could only produce that harsh rasp that sounded more threatening than soothing. Instead, he gently squeezed her shoulder, hoping she would understand the gesture as an attempt at comfort rather than control. They guided their horse down the main street, past a series of businesses that catered to the diverse population of the borderland territory. There was Martinez's Cantina, with its hand-painted sign in both Spanish and English, Thompson's General Store, advertising finest goods from San Francisco and New York, the Territorial Bank and Trust, its adobe walls painted a pristine white that stood out against the earth-toned buildings surrounding it. And everywhere people, Mexican vaqueros preparing for another day of ranch work, Anglo merchants opening their shops, Chinese laborers heading toward the railroad yards, and a scattering of Tohono O'odham Indians who moved through the crowd with the careful anonymity of people who understood their precarious position in this mixed community. Thomas noticed how people's eyes followed them as they passed. A silent white man traveling with an Apache child was unusual enough to draw attention, and in a frontier town where tensions between settlers and Indians ran high, such attention was rarely benign. He saw men's hands drift unconsciously toward their weapons, saw women pull their children closer as they passed. The weight of their stares felt heavier than the desert sun already beginning to beat down on them. Samuel Chen's trading post occupied a large corner lot near the center of town, its adobe walls extending back from the street to form a compound that included the main store, several storage buildings, and what appeared to be living quarters. A hand-painted sign hanging over the main entrance read, "Chen's Emporium, fine goods and fair dealing" in English, with smaller text in Chinese characters below. Thomas dismounted and helped Ayana down from the horse, noticing how she immediately positioned herself so that she could see all the exits from their current location. The child's survival instincts were razor-sharp, honed by experiences that no young person should have had to endure. She clutched her grandmother's bundle close to her chest, her knuckles white with tension. The main door of the trading post stood open, revealing an interior packed with an eclectic mix of merchandise. Thomas could see bolts of colorful fabric, agricultural tools, patent medicines, canned goods, household items, and what appeared to be a significant collection of Indian artifacts, pottery, jewelry, and woven goods that had likely been traded or sold by desperate tribal members in need of cash or supplies. A bell chimed as they entered, and from somewhere in the back of the store came the sound of footsteps approaching. Samuel Chen emerged from behind a tall display of preserved fruits, and Thomas immediately understood why Colonel Morrison had described him as a man who didn't ask too many questions. Chen was perhaps 50 years old, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of long years spent adapting to whatever circumstances life presented. His clothes were well made but practical, and his movements had the careful economy of someone who had learned to observe before acting. "Mr. McKenna, I presume," Chen said, his English carrying only the faintest trace of accent. His eyes moved quickly from Thomas to Ayana, taking in details with the practiced assessment of a man who had spent decades evaluating both people and merchandise. "Colonel Morrison's message said you might be arriving this morning." Thomas nodded and pulled out the leather pouch Morrison had given him, but Chen waved it away. "Business later," Chen said. "First, let me see what we're discussing." He looked directly at Ayana, his expression neutral but not unkind. "Child, do you understand English?" Ayana met his gaze steadily, and Thomas was struck by the dignity she managed to maintain, despite her obvious fear. "I understand English," she said quietly. "I also understand Spanish and 3 Apache dialects. My grandmother taught me that knowing many languages makes you valuable to people who might otherwise see no use for you." Chen's eyebrows rose slightly, and Thomas caught a glint of something that might have been respect in the older man's eyes. "Your grandmother was a wise woman. What else did she teach you?" "She taught me to read the weather by watching how animals behave. She taught me which plants can heal and which can harm. She taught me how to weave baskets that will hold water and how to prepare hides so they stay soft even in winter. She taught me the songs that help crops grow and the prayers that protect travelers. Ayana paused, then added quietly, "She taught me that surviving isn't the same as living, but sometimes you have to survive first before you can learn how to live." The silence that followed her words was profound. Thomas watched Chen's face, trying to read the calculations taking place behind his carefully controlled expression. This wasn't what any of them had expected. Morrison had described a traumatized, silent child who would require patient care and basic training. Instead, they were dealing with a young person who possessed sophisticated survival skills and demonstrated an intelligence that would be impossible to ignore. "Show me your hands," Chen said finally. Ayana hesitated, then extended her small hands palm up. Chen examined them carefully, noting the calluses that spoke of practical work, the nimble fingers that suggested dexterity, the lack of any deformities or injuries that might limit her usefulness. "Can you carry heavy things?" "I can carry what needs to be carried." "Can you work without complaining?" "I can work without making unnecessary noise." "Are you afraid of hard work?" For the first time since entering the store, Ayana's composure cracked slightly. "I'm afraid of many things, but work isn't one of them. Apache children learn to work before they learn to walk properly. Lazy children don't survive long enough to become lazy adults." Chen nodded slowly, then turned to Thomas. "This is not what Morrison described to me. He said I would be receiving a damaged child who needed to be trained from the beginning. This girl has skills that most adults lack, and an intelligence that could be either very valuable or very dangerous, depending on how it's handled." Thomas felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could see the direction Chen's thoughts were taking, could sense the shift from viewing Ayana as a burden to be managed to seeing her as an asset to be exploited. The child had revealed too much, shown too much capability, and now she would pay the price for her own competence. But before Thomas could figure out how to communicate his concerns without being able to speak clearly, Chen surprised him. "I run a legitimate business here," Chen said, his voice carrying a firmness that hadn't been there before. "I deal with customers from every background you can imagine. Mexican ranchers, Anglo merchants, Chinese railroad workers, Indian traders, Apache families coming in from the reservations. What I need is someone who can communicate with all of them, someone who can serve as a bridge between different worlds." He looked directly at Ayana again. "I'm not looking for a servant or a slave. I'm looking for an apprentice, someone who can learn the business, handle customers, keep records, manage inventory. It's hard work, but it's skilled work, and it comes with a wage. Not much at first, but enough to buy your own clothes, your own food, your own future if you're smart about it." Thomas felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying. This wasn't the transaction he had expected. Chen wasn't talking about ownership, he was talking about employment. It was still far from ideal. Ayana would be alone among strangers, cut off from what remained of her people, forced to adapt to a world that had little use for Apache traditions. But it was better than slavery, better than the reservation, better than most of the alternatives available to an orphaned Indian child in 1885. Ayana studied Chen's face with the same intensity she had used to evaluate Thomas the night before. "What would happen if I said no? If I decided I didn't want to work for you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. It was dangerous territory. A child questioning the decisions made by the adults who controlled her fate. Thomas tensed, ready to intervene if Chen reacted badly to what could be seen as insubordination. But Chen's response was measured, almost respectful. "If you said no, I would have to send you back to the territorial authorities. They would put you on a train to Florida with the rest of your people. I can't force you to work for me, and I wouldn't want an unwilling apprentice anyway. Bad attitudes are contagious in a business that depends on customer service. And if I said yes, but changed my mind later? If you changed your mind after giving it a fair try, we could discuss other arrangements. I have contacts in California, in Colorado, even back east. People who might need someone with your particular combination of skills. But you'd have to prove yourself first, show that you're reliable and trustworthy. Thomas watched this negotiation with growing amazement. Chen was treating Ayana like a person capable of making her own decisions, rather than a piece of property to be disposed of, according to the wishes of others. It was more respect than most white adults showed to Indian children, more autonomy than most women enjoyed in territorial society. Ayana was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes moving around the store, taking in the details of what might become her new home. Thomas could see her evaluating everything: the organization of the merchandise, the quality of the construction, the evidence of Chen's business practices scattered throughout the space. "I would want to keep my grandmother's things," she said finally. "They're sacred to my people, and I won't sell them or trade them no matter what." "Your personal possessions are your own business," Chen agreed, "as long as they don't interfere with your work or create problems with customers." I would want to be able to practice my songs, not during work hours, but in the evenings or early mornings. Music is how I pray, how I remember who I am. The living quarters are in the back building. What you do there on your own time is your affair, as long as you don't disturb the neighbors. "And I would want," Ayana hesitated, then looked at Thomas. "I would want to be able to write letters to people who might know where the rest of my family went. To the Apache who were sent to Florida, I need to find out if any of my relatives survived." This request clearly made Chen uncomfortable. Communication between Indians on reservations and those in the general population was often restricted, monitored, or forbidden entirely. Letters from an Apache child to relatives in federal custody could raise questions that a business owner wouldn't want to answer. But before Chen could respond, Thomas stepped forward. He pulled out a piece of paper from his vest pocket and wrote quickly, "I will handle correspondence, no official mail from your business." He showed the note to Chen, then to Ayana. Chen read the note and nodded slowly. "That would be acceptable. Mr. McKenna takes responsibility for any letters you want to send, but you understand that responses might be irregular. The government doesn't encourage communication between relocated Indians and those who remain in the territories." Ayana nodded grimly. She understood the realities of their situation better than most adults could appreciate. "One more thing," she said. "I want to know what happened to the man who brought me here, where he goes, what he does. Not because I plan to follow him, but because," she struggled to find the right words, "because he's the only person who knows my real story. If something happens to him, then everything about who I was before today disappears forever." Thomas felt the weight of this responsibility settle over him like a heavy coat. She was asking him to be her witness, her connection to the world she was being forced to leave behind. It was a role he wasn't sure he was qualified for, but looking at her serious young face, he found himself nodding agreement. Chen observed this exchange with the careful attention of someone trying to understand relationships that didn't fit into familiar categories. "Very well," he said finally. "It seems we have the basis for an arrangement, but I want to be clear about expectations. This is a business, not a charity. You'll work 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. You'll learn to read and write properly if you don't already know how. You'll learn basic arithmetic, inventory management, and customer relations. You'll dress appropriately for your position and conduct yourself in a manner that reflects well on this establishment." He paused, letting the weight of these requirements settle. "In return, you'll receive room and board, a small but regular wage, training in valuable skills, and the opportunity to build a future for yourself. It's not an easy life, but it's an honest one. And it's more freedom than most Indian children in your situation can expect." Ayana was quiet for several minutes, and Thomas could see her weighing options that all carried significant costs. Finally, she reached into her bundle and pulled out a small piece of turquoise, perfectly smooth and the color of summer sky. She held it up to the light, examining it carefully. "My grandmother gave this to me when I was very small," she said quietly. She told me it would help me make good decisions when I was far from home and didn't have elders to guide me. She said turquoise remembers the sky and the earth, and that if I held it when I was confused, it would help me remember who I was meant to be. She closed her eyes for a moment, clutching the stone tightly. When she opened them again, her expression was resolute. I'll work for you, Mr. Chen. I'll learn what you teach me and do my best to help your business succeed. But I want you to understand something important. I'm not becoming a different person. I'm still Apache. I'm still the granddaughter of Strong Bear Woman and the daughter of Singing Wolf. Working for you doesn't change that, and I won't pretend it does. Chen extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Ayana shook it. Understood. Your heritage is your own business. What matters to me is your work and your honesty. Everything else is between you and whatever spirits you choose to follow. With the handshake, the transaction was officially complete, but Thomas felt none of the relief he had expected. Instead, he found himself grappling with a complex mixture of emotions he couldn't easily identify. Relief that Ayana wouldn't be heading to a reservation in Florida, guilt that he had participated in separating her from what remained of her people, pride that she had negotiated terms that preserved some measure of her dignity, and underneath it all, a strange sense of loss, as if he were giving up something valuable that he had only just discovered. Chen led them through the store to the living quarters in the back, a modest but clean apartment consisting of 2 rooms, a small kitchen area, and access to a shared washhouse. The furnishings were simple but adequate. A narrow bed, a desk and chair, a chest for personal belongings, and a window that looked out onto a small courtyard where Chen kept supplies for the business. You'll take your meals with my family, Chen explained. My wife is an excellent cook, and she's been hoping for some help with our younger children. They're energetic boys who could benefit from someone closer to their own age to keep them occupied. Thomas noticed that Chen didn't mention his wife's nationality or background, and he wondered what other cultural boundaries were being crossed in this household. The frontier had a way of forcing people to adapt to circumstances that would have been unthinkable in more settled areas, creating unlikely alliances and unexpected forms of cooperation. As they completed the tour of Ayana's new home, Chen pulled Thomas aside. I want to discuss the financial arrangements, he said quietly. Colonel Morrison mentioned $200, but after meeting the girl, I think we need to adjust our agreement. Thomas tensed, wondering if Chen was about to change the terms now that he had seen Ayana's capabilities. But the older man's next words surprised him. She's worth more than Morrison indicated, much more. Her language skills alone make her valuable, and her intelligence suggests she'll be able to handle responsibilities I hadn't originally considered. I'm willing to pay $300, but I want to structure the payment differently. Chen pulled out a pencil and paper and began sketching numbers. 100 now, as originally planned. Another 100 at the end of her first year, provided she's still here and performing satisfactorily. The final 100 when she turns 18, assuming she chooses to continue working for me as an adult employee rather than an apprentice. Thomas studied the proposed arrangement, understanding immediately what Chen was doing. By spreading the payments over time, he was creating incentives for Thomas to maintain some connection to Ayana's situation, to check on her welfare and ensure she was being treated fairly. It was a clever way of building accountability into a transaction that could easily become exploitative. But there was something else in Chen's proposal, something that spoke to a longer-term vision that Thomas hadn't expected. Chen was thinking about Ayana's future as an adult, planning for a time when she would have the legal and practical freedom to make her own choices about her life and career. It suggested a level of respect for her potential that went far beyond what most employers would offer to any young apprentice, let alone an Indian child. Thomas nodded his agreement, and Chen counted out the first $100 in gold coins. The weight of the money felt different now than it had when Morrison first offered it. What had started as payment for a simple transportation job had become something more complex, an investment in a young person's future, a down payment on possibilities that none of them could fully envision. As they concluded their business, Chen made one final request. "I'd appreciate it if you could stay in town for a few days, just to help her get settled. Change is difficult for anyone, but especially for someone who's lost as much as she has. Having a familiar face around might make the transition easier." Thomas looked at Ayana, who was standing by the window looking out at the courtyard with an expression he couldn't read. She had handled the negotiations with remarkable maturity, but she was still a 9-year-old child who had just committed to spending the next several years among strangers in an unfamiliar world. He nodded to Chen, then walked over to where Ayana stood. She looked up at him, and for the first time since they had met, he saw tears gathering in her dark eyes. "I know this is what I have to do," she said quietly. "I know it's better than the alternatives, but I'm scared, Silent Man. I'm scared of forgetting who I am. I'm scared of becoming someone my grandmother wouldn't recognize." Thomas wanted desperately to offer her some word of comfort, some assurance that everything would work out for the best. Instead, he did the only thing he could do. He opened his damaged throat and hummed the same melody he had shared with her in the cave. Amazing grace, transformed by his scarred vocal cords into something that sounded like wind through broken stone. When he finished, Ayana wiped her eyes and began to hum along, adding her own harmonies to the simple tune. Together, their voices created something new, not quite Apache, not quite Anglo, but uniquely theirs. It was the sound of two damaged souls finding a way to communicate across the barriers that separated them, a musical bridge spanning the gulf between worlds that seemed to have no place for people like them. Chen listened from across the room, and Thomas thought he saw something like understanding cross the older man's features. Perhaps Chen recognized the song they were creating because he had sung similar melodies himself, the bittersweet harmonies of immigrants and outcasts, people who had learned to make new homes in spaces between the worlds they had lost and the worlds they were still learning to navigate. As the afternoon sun slanted through the window, painting the small room in shades of gold and amber, Thomas began to understand that his relationship with Ayana was far from over. The promises he had made in the cave, to remember her name, to preserve her identity, to help her find her way back to her people if the opportunity arose, those weren't obligations that would end when he rode out of Tucson. They were commitments that would shape whatever remained of his own life, connections that would transform them both in ways neither could yet imagine. The weight of gold coins in his pocket felt heavier than it should have, but for the first time in years, Thomas thought he might be carrying something more valuable than money. He was carrying the trust of a child who had lost everything but refused to surrender her essential self. It was a responsibility that terrified him, but it was also the first thing in 3 years of silence that had made him feel truly alive. Outside, the sounds of Tucson continued, merchants calling their wares, horses and wagons moving through the dusty streets, church bells marking the passage of time. But inside the small room, 3 people from different worlds were creating something new together, a fragile alliance built on mutual need and unexpected respect. It wasn't the ending any of them had expected, but perhaps, Thomas thought, it might be the beginning of something none of them could have imagined.